I should wash this. Hi folks, welcome to Glitter Void Gamecraft. My name is Eric and today we're talking about washes. Washes are an essential component of miniature painting and terrain building at this scale. If you don't know what a wash is, I will tell you. If you don't know when you should use one, I will show you. And best of all, if you would like to save a lot of money on them, I will show you how to make some. Got 3 recipes coming at you. Let's get to it. So, what is a wash? A wash is essentially a very diluted kind of a paint that you use in certain situations. A wash has basically 3 elements. There is a medium, the thing that transports the color around, the pigment, which is what gives it its color, and then a surfactant, which is a very fancy word meaning something that breaks up the surface tension. This is because the main use of a wash is to put it on, whether it's a miniature or a piece of terrain, and that wash goes into all of the cracks and any of the details, any of the folds in modeled fabric or the pitting in stone, and it settles in there and deposits its pigment in those areas versus a regular paint where you would slather it on and it just goes wherever you put it. How should you use a wash? There's pretty much 3 purposes for it. One is to create definition. When you're working at a very small scale, it can be hard to create something that feels like not a little plastic toy. So putting the wash on something and having it settle into those recesses really gives definition to the piece and makes it feel larger than it is. The second use is to create shadows. When you have someone who's standing there and they have a beautiful piece of fabric draped over them, that fabric is not all one color. It has areas where there's folding or creasing, layers over layers, where there is a shadow being cast. And that is, along with definition, a very important part about miniature painting and terrain building, because if you don't create that feeling that there is a light source, it just feels like a little painted toy and not a brave hero or a mighty castle. And the last use can be very similar to what a glaze would do, which is to tint something. When you take a miniature that has a white cloak and you paint it with a brown wash, the wash will mostly settle into the recesses and some of that detail, creating lines and shadows and definition, but it will also tint the entire piece. This can be nice to create transitions, or the way I mostly use it in terrain is to grime something up and make it feel a little more messy. But enough of my yakking, let's get to actually creating some washes.
Before I get too far, I wanted to make sure I mentioned store-bought washes. Of course, you can always go out and spend your hard-earned money on these. These are great, and I love working with them. With miniatures or in small details, they are fantastic. Problem is, they are very expensive. The Army Painter ones will run you about $4 each, and the Citadel ones will run you $5 to $6 each. That is way too much money to be spending on washes, especially when we can make our own. Let's get to the recipes. For this first one, let's remember our components of each wash. We have a medium, in this case, water. We have a pigment, black craft paint, and we have our surfactant, just regular old dish soap. This is about as cheap as you can possibly get and about as simple as well. The recipe here is simple. It's approximately a 10-to-1 ratio of water to paint, so 10 parts water, 1 part paint, and then just a few drops of the surfactant. Any kind of dish soap should work, but I tend to go for a rinse aid. The detergents tend to bubble a lot more than that, and that can be annoying to work with. So you just add a few drops to the mixture, and you can already see it working. Something I would use a wash like this for would be if I was doing a very large project, say a gaming table for Warhammer, or large cliffs, or some project where you could definitely get away with slapping a bottle of this paint into some water and then just taking a large paintbrush to it and covering everything. So here you can see how runny this mixture is. It's not stain where it would go like regular paint. It will just run down into the recesses and pick up that detail like we want it to. Recipe number 2. So we need our medium, which in this case is going to be water and a matte acrylic medium. A pigment, here we're using 2 colors of acrylic ink, and a surfactant. Still using that rinse aid. Now this is not my recipe. I got this from Jeremy over at Blackmagic Craft. He has a great video about it, and I've been using this for months, and I absolutely love it. I like to mix big batches of this at a time in these little shampoo containers I got from dollar store or drugstore. The brand of this medium doesn't really matter, but what you definitely want is matte. That is something with no shine to it. So the recipe is pretty simple. It's equal parts of the water and the acrylic medium, but make sure you leave a little bit of space at the top because we need room to shake this and mix it up, and then a little bit for the ink and the surfactant. And then you put the lid on and just give it a good old shake. Once that's all mixed up, what you have now is a blank slate. It is a wash with no pigment in it, so we can do whatever we want at this point. The recipe for the color is really whatever you want. Experiment a little bit as you're going in, but definitely start on the light side. Here, what I use is 10 drops of black and then 3 drops of the brown. I find that pure black ink tends to look a little cartoonish in the shadows. The brown just adds a hint of realism. Give it a good shake, and now you're ready to test it out on something. Something else nice about using these little shampoo bottles is when you shake up this mixture, it tends to bubble a little bit. But the small opening actually keeps the bubbles from coming through. So you shake it up in the container, pour it out into a pallet or some sort of container, and then you don't have to worry about bubbles. Something I have noticed about this homemade style of wash is it tends to look kind of gray when you dump it out. I don't really know why that happens, but I suspect it has to do with just the fact that the medium looks white when it's wet, but when it dries, it's clear. Find a little piece of something, ideally with some sort of texture. This is a little fragment of a plank, and test out the wash on it. Here we can see the wash doing what it's supposed to be doing, but I don't really like the way it's going so far, so I'm going to end up adding some more ink to this mixture. Take it slow and don't go too wild when adding this ink. You can always add more. It's much harder to take it out. So here we have a much darker looking mixture, and I tested out on a similar fragment. That's much closer to the way I want this wash to look. I tend to want these to be dark because using them on large pieces of terrain, I don't want to have to go back and do a second coat. Now to talk about price. This is not expensive per milliliter or whatever, but it is a little expensive to get started. A bottle of this medium will probably set you back 12 or 15 US dollars, and the inks are about $7 to $10 a piece, but you will use so little of this in the process of making washes. Think of it like cooking. If you had to go into a grocery store and buy spices for a dish, and you needed cumin and paprika and tarragon and cinnamon, you could be walking out with $30, $40 in spices. But once you have all of the ingredients, you don't really use that much per preparation. The last recipe I want to show you is very similar to the one that I just did. The only difference is I replaced the rinse aid with this Vallejo airbrush flow improver. It is both a surfactant and what is called a drying retardant, so it slows down the drying process. That's not really important to me, but I already had this lying around, so I wanted to test this out. The main advantage to using this is it doesn't bubble. So if I were mixing up, say, a small batch of a specific color, and I was going to do that in a palette, I would probably use this because then I wouldn't have to worry about bubbles when I was swirling everything together in my palette, since I didn't have the bottle to filter out the bubbles. The recipe is the same as before, 1-to-1 mixture of water and medium, and then a little bit of ink, and then just a drop or two of the airbrush flow improver. So here I am just preparing the palette with a dropper so that I don't have to mix up a large batch and waste any pigment. On this test piece I used, it actually looked really good going on. I'm not sure if that's because I used a smaller brush so I wasn't drowning the piece in it, or if this is really looking this much better, or because of my ratios are all wonky because I'm working on such a small scale. Let's get scientific. I have 4 test pieces here that we're going to use: a store-bought wash, the paint and water mixture, the medium and inks with the rinse aid, and the medium and inks with the airbrush flow improver. So I'm gonna slather all of these pieces with it and give it a little bit of time to dry, and we'll come back and see which one is the best. I'm not going to make you sit here and watch paint dry even at 10 times speed, but here we have it, the 4 test pieces. And the winner is, you decide. Don't let me or anyone else tell you how your terrain should end up looking. If you like the look of the cheap craft paint and water mixture, go for it. It's certainly a subtler and slightly more realistic kind of shadow. After all, this really isn't that scientific since there's no controlling of ratios of paint and pigment, especially with the smaller batches that I mixed up.
So there you have it, 3 recipes for creating washes suitable for just about any budget. If you use any of those recipes that I showed you, or you have your own, let me know in the comments below. Always looking for new ideas. If you found this video useful, consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.